today is by no means anything new. It is very well known. It has been taught, it has been preached many times. I've read it many times over the years. And while I read the text all these times, I found it meaningful. But it was not until a later time that I grasped something that I had kind of glossed over before. And when I did, it really got my attention. And it really cut deeply into my heart. And it's been on my heart for some time now, and I regularly reflect on it. And I look back in my life and I see how this has had an influence on me since I was very young, up until the present and continuing on today. And I also see it playing out in the lives of people that I know. So when I speak to you today, I'm speaking to myself as much as I am to anyone else. And the text for today comes from the Gospel of Luke, 22nd chapter, verses 31 through 34. Let's take a look at the context of this to begin with. Jesus had made his triumphal entry into Jerusalem and been hailed by the crowds as king. Jesus drove the money changers from the temple, and he taught there in the temple, preaching the gospel and teaching every day. As the Passover drew near, the chief priests and scribes plotted to kill Jesus, and Judas agreed to betray him. In verse 24, during the Last Supper, a dispute arose among the disciples as to which of them was to be regarded as the greatest. And again, the expectation was that Jesus would take the throne as king of Israel, and they would all have important positions within that. Verses 31 and 32, Jesus spoke to Peter. He said, "Simon, Simon." Okay, repeating it. "Simon, Simon." Okay, adding emphasis to it. In other words, pay attention. This is something important. Then he uses the word behold. So Simon, Simon, behold. Okay, got something to share with you. I need you to really pay attention to. And he says, Satan has demanded to have you, that he might sift you like wheat. But I have prayed for you that your faith may not fail. And when you have turned again, strengthen your brothers. So the part that really struck me was when he said, okay, Satan wants to sift you, and I'm going to allow it to happen. Okay. Now, Peter's reply to this is not recorded. But if I was told that Satan wants to beat you up really bad, and he's going to be able to do it, it would terrify me. That's a scary process. But he also said three important things. One was, okay, that he would allow Satan to sift him like wheat, and Peter would be subjected to this ordeal. And he prayed that Peter's faith would not fail. He would survive the shifting, okay? Jesus prayed to his Father. When Jesus prayed to his Father, it was a done deal. It was locked in. Okay, so his faith was not going to fail. And Peter was also assigned a task. That when he had turned again, he was to strengthen his brothers. So he would be sifted. His faith would not fail, and he was to go on then to strengthen his brothers. Verse 33, Peter said to him, Lord, I'm ready to go with you to prison and to death. A very brave statement, okay? A lot of pride, very strong statement. Peter had a strong personality. He was a working man. He was a fisherman, so he was strong. Physically, he was strong. His personality was strong. And he was going to go all the way with Jesus. And then in verse 34, Jesus said, I tell you, Peter, The rooster will not crow until you deny 3 times that you know me. Okay? And again, there is no indication there. It's not recorded what reply Peter made to this, if any. Then as we move ahead to verses 54 through 62, we see that this is exactly what happened. Jesus was arrested. He was taken to the house of the high priest. Peter followed along and entered into the courtyard. And while he was there, Peter was confronted about being a disciple of Jesus, and he denied it. And after the 3rd denial, the rooster crowed. Said Jesus turned and looked directly at Peter. Peter got the look. Okay? You ever gotten the look when you did something really wrong? You know, you were in a lot of trouble. Okay, it's like, oh, how do I get out of this? Okay? Peter remembered Jesus saying, before the rooster crows today, you will deny me 3 times. I can only imagine how Peter felt. He had completely failed his Lord. Okay? This was Peter the bold. Peter, who Jesus said that he would build his church on. One of the 3 disciples who witnessed the transfiguration. Peter, who walked on water. Peter, who was the one who struck the servant of the high priest when Jesus was arrested. Peter, who many regard as the most prominent disciple. Peter was devastated. He was humiliated. He was totally crushed. Even more so in his own heart. Peter went out and wept bitterly. The threshing of Peter had begun, but was not over. Jesus was severely beaten and crucified. Peter, as well as the other disciples, had expected Jesus to assume an earthly role as king of Israel, and they would have important roles. They were going to be important people. Although Jesus had told them a number of times about his death, the disciples just did not understand. Okay? But let's talk for a minute about the significance of threshing. Okay? Threshing floors are mentioned a number of times in the scriptures and is a part of Jewish tradition. Threshing is essentially dividing, that is separating wheat kernels from the chaff. The wheat sheaves are placed on a flat, hard surface and beaten with threshing sledges. This separates the kernels of the wheat from the chaff and remain on the floor to be gathered up. The chaff has no weight, or very little weight, and is thrown up in the air and is blown away by the wind. John the Baptist, the voice of one crying in the desert, prepare the way for the Lord, spoke to the crowds about threshing while he was preaching and baptizing in the wilderness. In Matthew 3rd chapter, 12th verse, John the Baptist speaking of Jesus, it says, his winnowing fork is in his hand, and he shall clear his threshing floor and gather his wheat into the barn. With the chaff he shall burn up with inextinguishable fire. When a person is threshed, they're placed in a situation that puts that person in a situation in which the chaff in their life is removed. The kernels remain, the chaff is removed. In some instances, the reason for the threshing may be evident to the person who is being threshed. And other times, it might not be clear. Now, I will not presume to know the will or the method of the Lord. It may be the removal of things in our lives which are sinful, harmful, and detrimental to the relationship God desires to have with us. God desires to have a close relationship, parent, child, okay? But there may be things in our life which prevent that from happening because God hates sin, okay? This also includes self-interest, thinking everything is about you. Ever know anybody like that? I'm guilty. I fully admit it. God still has to work with me a little bit in that regard. Pride is another thing which can be removed. Pride is the making ourselves our God. It is a form of idolatry which God hates. Just as money, fame, power can be forms of idolatry. Exodus, the 20th chapter, 2nd verse says, "You shall have no other gods before me." This is also includes self-sufficiency, taking credit for everything we have, not recognizing and giving thanks to God for all He's provided. I've been guilty of that myself. I worked for it, I paid for it, it's mine and nobody else's, okay. Totally out of line. But being threshed is decidedly unpleasant. It can be painful, humiliating, and can be absolutely overwhelming. Threshing is not intended to make people suffer for their sins. Okay? God uses this process to bring His children into the relationship which He desires to have with them. Hebrews, 12th chapter, verses 10 through 11, says He disciplines us for our good, that we may share His holiness. For the moment all discipline seems painful rather than pleasant, but later it yields the peaceful fruit of righteousness to those who have been trained by it. And God will use whatever circumstances necessary to accomplish this. Some years ago, I had a conversation with a man who was in trouble. He was in a lot of trouble. He had been arrested. He was looking at the possibility of a period of incarceration. And this man was angry. He was confrontational, violent. He was not a very pleasant person to be around. He was absolutely terrified of spending time in jail and said that he could not possibly bear this. So after listening to him then for a while, I told him, I said, you know, maybe God needs to put you in jail in order to change you. It's like silence. Okay? Whatever means necessary. Threshing can also serve to build a person up and prepare them for greater service to the Lord. Threshing can change the direction of a person's life to something more beneficial. There are a couple of things about threshing which are important to understand. Is, first of all, we may not understand why we are threshed, and we may never know. I can look back at my own life and I can see times that that's happened. There may have been others that I'm not aware of. And we may not know how long this threshing will last. It's not like it happens today and it's gone tomorrow. It will go on for a very extended period of time. We also may not know how many times we will be threshed. Not just a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. It can be repeated a number of times. In Genesis 37, verses 50, we have all heard the story of Joseph and how he was able to save his family and the nation of Israel. Joseph was threshed several times, and is an excellent example of the process and the positive outcomes of it. Threshing was extremely unpleasant and difficult. Forcibly removed from his country, sold into slavery, and imprisoned in a dungeon for years after being falsely accused. Joseph went on to become the second highest person in Egypt and saved his people and the people of Egypt from starvation. But throughout this process, which went over a number of years, Joseph did not know that God was using him to save so many people. Can you imagine the turmoil, the doubts, the fear, the anger, the sleepless nights experienced after being placed in a cistern by his own brothers, sold into slavery with no control over his life, being imprisoned in the dungeon for years? Joseph was a young man when he was sold into slavery and lacked maturity and life skills. Being his father's favorite, his life was sheltered. Serving in the household of Potiphar, Joseph was blessed by God. And here he learned responsibility, supervision, and management skills, which led to him being placed in charge of Potiphar's household. After being falsely accused in prison, Joseph was blessed and found favor with the jailer, who was placed in charge of the jail. It's a nice position, but even if you're the head jailer, you're still in jail, okay? Not a fun process. He came to the attention of the Pharaoh, who made him the second highest person in Egypt. And in this position, Joseph saved the people of Israel and Egypt from starvation. Ultimately, Joseph realized that, what his family had meant for evil, God meant for good. But it was not an easy road, and it was a long road. Another example, we look to the book of Job. Job was a man of whom God said, there is no one on earth like him. He is blameless and upright, a man who fears God and shuns evil. Job was prosperous and the greatest man among all the people of the East. But God allowed Job to be threshed, and all his property and his family was taken from him, and he was afflicted with painful sores from the soles of his feet to the top of his head. He was reduced from being the greatest man among the people of the East to an impoverished and afflicted man sitting in the dust, subject to the ridicule of other people. Big step down in life. The reason for Job's threshing is not clear. And again, I do not presume to know the will and the method, or to question the will and the method of God. Job did not know the reason for this threshing and suffered both emotionally and physically. And the time frame over which this took place is not clear. It may have been over a number of years. Job 1:6 says, one day the angels came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came with them. This was the beginning of Job's first ordeal. All of his possessions and all his family was taken away from him. Drop down to Job 2:1. It says, on another day the angels came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came with them to present himself before him. This was the beginning of Job's second ordeal. He was allowed Satan to inflict him with painful sores. Now the Bible does not say what the interval of time was between the times the angels came to present themselves before the Lord. A difficult transition for Job. In chapter 2, verses 11 through 13, Job's three friends came to sympathize with him and comfort him. They sat on the ground with him for 7 days and 7 nights. No one said a word to him because of his suffering was so great. In chapter 3, verses 1 through 2, Job cursed the day of his birth. And in verse 26 said, I have no peace, no quietness, I have no rest, but only turmoil. Job's possession and family were eventually restored. The time frame for all this taking place is not clear. But there are two important points to take away from the story of Job. Job, like Joseph, did not know why he was being threshed. He had done no wrong. The same is often true of us today. We may never know the reason. And sometimes we may go through very difficult times. We may go through the threshing process when we have done nothing wrong. And second point is, more importantly, nothing happens to people unless God permits it to happen. Satan was not able to do anything to Job without God's permission. We go back to the story of Peter. Jesus told him that Satan demanded to have you, that he might sift him like wheat. Satan could do nothing unless God allowed it to happen. We look at the life of David, another story of threshing. Although David was anointed king of Israel, he did not actually ascend to the throne until a number of years later. He spent years in hiding in the hills from Saul the king, who was jealous and wanted to kill him. David did nothing to provoke this persecution, and on several occasions he had the opportunity to kill Saul, but he did not do so. Psalm 22, 1 through 2, is a psalm by David. It was a psalm written while David was hiding in the wilderness from Saul. He said, my God, why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far from saving me, so far from the words of my groaning? It was a difficult time, difficult process for him, but David was being prepared to be king. David was threshed when confronted with his sin of his relationship with Bathsheba and having her husband murdered. David was threshed when he was forced to flee Jerusalem from his son Absalom, who was trying to take the throne. David was threshed when he saw the angel who was striking down the people of Israel because of his sin. The angel who was afflicting the people had stretched out his hand to destroy Jerusalem. 2 Samuel 24:16, the Lord said to the angel, enough, withdraw your hand. Then in verse 17, David said to God, I am the one who has sinned and done wrong. These are the sheep. What have they done? Let your hand fall upon me and my family. Sin was being removed from David's life. I find it interesting that when told to withdraw his hand, the angel of the Lord was at the threshing floor of Araunah, the Jebusite. After this, David bought the threshing floor, built an altar there where he offered sacrifices. Now, according to Jewish history, this threshing floor was a place on Mount Moriah where God told Abraham that he was to sacrifice his son Isaac. And it was here on this threshing floor that the Temple of Jerusalem was later built. A couple of points to kind of emphasize to you is, first of all, threshing may be intended to correct a person's actions, removal of attitudes and or behavior. It may be to prepare a person for additional service for the Lord or to a different area of service. Threshing works to bring people into the relationship which God desires to have with them. And God's desire is to have a close relationship with each and every one of us. Okay? But it may require the removal of certain things from our lives. It may require preparation to put us in a different direction in order to do this. The process is not pleasant, and it may involve stress, pain, and or humiliation. It may require the purification of an individual. Job, the 23rd chapter, the 10th verse, Job said, when he has tested me, I shall come forth as gold. Again, people may never know why they're being threshed. They go on for an extended period of time. But every one of you is the child of God. Nothing will happen to you unless God allows it to happen. You know, once that realization started sinking into me, It changed my whole outlook on life, the world around me. And oftentimes I have to remind myself, if I'm going through a time that I'm not enjoying too much or is hurtful, unpleasant, remind myself I'm the child of God. Nothing is going to affect me unless God permits it to happen. And the same true of all of us here, all of God's children worldwide. And God will restore those whom He has threshed. Genesis chapter 50, verses 22 through 23. Joseph stayed in Egypt along with his family, father's family. He lived 110 years and saw the third generation of Ephraim's children, also the children of Machir, the son of Manasseh, were placed at birth on Joseph's knee. What a blessing, what a joy to see so many of your descendants. Okay. Job 42, verses 12 and 16. The Lord blessed the latter part of Job's life more than the first. After this, Job lived 140 years, and he saw his children and their children to the fourth generation. And in 2 Kings chapter 2, verses 10 through 11, then David rested with his fathers and was buried in the city of David. He had reigned 40 years over Israel, 7 years in Hebron and 33 years in Jerusalem. Now, after the resurrection his resurrection, Jesus appeared to Peter and other disciples by the Sea of Tiberias, and he ate with them. John 21, 15 through 19. When they finished eating, Jesus said to Simon Peter, "Simon, son of John, do you truly love me more than these?" "Yes, Lord," he said, "you know that I love you." Jesus said, "Feed my lambs." Again, Jesus said, "Simon, son of John, do you truly love me?" He answered, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." Jesus said, "Take care of my sheep." The third time he said to him, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" Peter was hurt because Jesus asked him the third time, "Do you love me?" He said, "Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you." Jesus said, "Feed my sheep. I tell you the truth, when you were younger, you dressed yourself and went where you wanted. But when you are old, you will stretch out your hands, and someone else will dress you and lead you to where you do not want to go." And Jesus said this to indicate the kind of death by which Peter would glorify God. He said to him, "Follow me." Peter had been threshed, his faith had not failed, and he went forth to follow Jesus, to preach the gospel, to glorify the Lord in a martyr's death. So I pose a question to you today. Does God thresh nations? He threshes people. Does he thresh nations? Well, he did so to Israel. Okay? People of Israel fell into idolatry and sin. God repeatedly warned them to repent and return to Him. Jeremiah 22nd chapter, 5th verse. God speaking through Jeremiah says, "But if you do not obey these commands, declares the Lord, I swear by myself that this palace will become a ruin." God's people did not obey Him and continued in their disobedience and their wickedness. But before God imposed the destruction of Jerusalem and the exile of the entire country, He spoke to them of His plans to restore them and to bless them. Jeremiah 29, beginning with the 10th verse. This is what the Lord says. When 70 years are completed for Babylon, I will come to you and fulfill my generous promise to bring you back to this place. For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you hope and future. Then you will call upon and come and pray to me, and I will listen to you. You will seek me and find me when you seek me with all your heart. I will be found by you, declares the Lord, and will bring you back from captivity, from all the nations and places where I have banished you, declares the Lord, and will bring you back to the place from which I carried you into exile. Before the exile was even initiated, he had plans. He told them, these are my plans. You're going to go through this. You're going to be restored. Jeremiah 39th chapter, summarizing verses 1 through 9. In the 9th year of Zedekiah, king of Judah, in the 10th month, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, destroyed Jerusalem and carried the people of the city into exile. To fulfill the word of the Lord through Jeremiah, this exile lasted for 70 years. We go on to the book of Ezra, chapter 1, verses 1 and 3. In the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia, in order to fulfill the word of the Lord, spoken by Jeremiah, the Lord moved the hearts of Cyrus, the king of Persia, to make a proclamation throughout the realm and put it in writing. Any one of his people among you, may his God be with him, and let him go up to Jerusalem and build the temple of the Lord, the God of Israel. This was the beginning of the restoration of Israel. The Jewish people did not revolt, and they did not win their right to go back. No one persuaded Cyrus to allow this to happen. God moved Cyrus's heart to allow the return, in order to fulfill the word of the Lord spoken by Jeremiah. Now, I bring this message today. It's been on my heart for a long time, because I know that there are people who are being threshed today. Okay? Some are angry, some are confused, frustrated, and hurting. And I want to offer reassurance to all who are in this situation. This is a process that God has allowed for His purpose and for your good. It's not intended as punishment. It's God working in lives in order to improve them, so that He might have a closer relationship with them, that they might be moved into other areas of life that would be more beneficial to them. Now, again, we don't know the reason. We may never know. I can tell you, I can look back at my own life, back at situations that I went through where things changed in my life. Sometimes they changed in my life when I didn't want my life to change. I was perfectly content to be there. And sometimes it was painful and it was stressful. But I can look back and I can now understand that that was God moving in my life. And not only did I go through it, but now I can see how much better my life is as a result of it. Okay? So I offer that today because we don't know the reason, may never know, but God will bring you through this. Because you are well loved and precious in the eyes of the Lord. You are His children. As Brother Brian, worship team, comes back, just a couple of more things in closing. Something to consider. I've been threshed, I say, a number of times. Once was not enough. Twice was not enough. More fingers than I have, okay? Sometimes it takes me a long time to figure these things out, but with the perspective of time, I can remember while they were in process, I didn't enjoy them too much. But I do see the hand of God in each. I see how God brought me into these situations and brought me through them and the outcome. During those times, I learned not to ask God to change the circumstances. Okay? I accept this process, and who am I to argue with God? I pray for strength. I pray for patience, endurance, and I pray that I may be able to embrace those areas that God is changing in me. Something, you may wish to consider. And also, when I'm aware of other people who are being threshed, I do not pray for the circumstances that they're in. But I do pray for the person, for strength, for patience, for endurance through this entire process. So in closing, I'd just like to thank you for the opportunity for being here today, and may God bless you. We look forward to Pastor Mike's